The heavy medical bag slid from Fiona's shoulder as she stepped into her apartment. But the familiar click of her heels on the hardwood was replaced by the sound of heavy mahogany scraping against the floor. In the flickering shadows of her rearranged living room, a pot hissed on the stove, sending a thick, greasy cloud of rendered lard into the air. Through the haze, she saw her 10-year-old son pinned against a chair, his face waxy and pale, while a pair of gnarled, white-knuckled hands forced a spoonful of glistening, forbidden gray sludge toward his locked lips. Fiona lunged forward, her boots skidding on the linoleum as she reached for the ceramic bowl. But a sharp, powerful shove sent her reeling back against the refrigerator. Just as she opened her mouth to scream, a dry electrical pop echoed through the walls, and the apartment plunged into a suffocating, absolute darkness. In the sudden silence, the only sounds were her son's panicked, hitching gasps for air, and the rhythmic, metallic jingle of a duplicate set of keys being twirled by an invisible hand in the corner of the room. Fiona O'Leary leaned her forehead against the cool, brushed metal of the elevator wall, listening to the monotonous, rhythmic hum of the cables. The heavy medical bag dragged at her shoulder, its strap biting deep into a cramped collarbone. Her fingers twitched with a fine, persistent tremor as she fumbled to slot her key into the apartment lock. Behind her eyelids, the ghost images of heart monitors pulsed, and the ragged, desperate breathing of the ICU patients she had tended for the last 20 hours echoed in her inner ear. Her legs felt like they had been poured full of molten lead, and the world blurred into a smear of colored spots under the flickering hallway lights. Fiona craved nothing but the release of shedding her sweat-stained scrubs, collapsing into the soft embrace of her pillows, and drowning in the redemptive silence of an empty home. She stepped across the threshold and stumbled, her toe catching the edge of a massive wooden sideboard that belonged in the master bedroom. Instead of the familiar, open breath of her living room, Fiona faced a claustrophobic labyrinth of heavy armchairs and a sofa wrenched toward the window at an unnatural angle. The rug lay crooked, exposing pale, unvarnished strips of hardwood floor like open wounds. Across the room, Margaret grunted with effort, dragging a mahogany coffee table through the center of the space with a piercing screech of wood on wood. The air hung thick with the smell of disturbed dust, kicked up from corners that hadn't seen the light in years. Margaret stood back, surveying her rearranged kingdom with a nod of cold satisfaction, smoothing lace doilies over furniture that didn't belong. Fiona felt the blood begin to throb in her temples. The quiet sanctuary of her life was dissolving into a chaos dictated by Margaret's iron whims. Fiona drifted toward the kitchen, where a thick, suffocating cloud of rendered lard and boiled onions slapped her in the face. On the stove, a cavernous stockpot hissed and bubbled, spitting greasy droplets onto the pristine white tiles. Margaret stirred the grayish slurry with a heavy wooden spoon, lifting dripping chunks of overcooked pork and yellow globules of fat. Fiona's eyes darted to the stack of medical instructions for Sean resting precariously on the edge of the counter. Margaret ignored the forbidden list, scooping a brimming spoonful of the glistening sludge. Sean sat at the table, his face a waxy mask of silence, watching as his grandmother shook a heavy cloud of salt and spices into the pot. Ingredients that acted like slow poison on his fragile, inflamed stomach. Fiona forced a deep, stabilizing breath and pressed her palm against the edge of the hot stove, trying to catch Margaret's averted gaze. Her voice came out muffled, a dry rasp as she asked Margaret to kill the burner and move the pot. Margaret continued her rhythmic tapping, the spoon clinking against the rim of the pot as she stared through Fiona at the kitchen window. Fiona repeated the request, louder this time, pointing a trembling finger at the dietary chart pinned to the refrigerator. Margaret merely tightened her lips until her mouth became a thin, bloodless slit, and with a defiant flick of her wrist, she turned the gas flame higher. Margaret began to hum a low, old Irish tune, her voice rising to drown out Fiona's presence, systematically erasing her daughter-in-law from the room. Margaret slammed a deep ceramic bowl, brimming with steaming meat, onto the table directly in front of Sean. Fiona watched, frozen for a heartbeat, as Margaret gripped a spoon and forced it against the boy's tightly locked lips. Sean tried to twist his head away, but Margaret's gnarled, knotty fingers clamped onto his jaw, pinning him in place with terrifying precision. Greasy brown gravy splattered across Sean's clean t-shirt, blooming into stubborn yellow stains. Margaret crooned in a tone that was soft as velvet, but hard as rebar, commanding him to swallow the heavy, unctuous chunks. Fiona felt the marrow in her bones turn to ice as Margaret shoved another portion of the rancid stew into the terrified boy's mouth, ignoring the way his hands flailed against the edge of the table. Fiona lunged forward, her boots skidding on the linoleum as she reached the table and gripped the edges of the greasy bowl. Her fingers slipped on the slick ceramic while she tried to wrench the dish from Margaret's grasp. Margaret held on with a dead, white-knuckled strength, causing the hot liquid to slop over the tablecloth and scald Fiona's knuckles. Fiona screamed that Margaret was killing her own grandson with this filth. Margaret hissed back a string of curses, calling Fiona a hysterical failure who couldn't even put meat on a child's bones. The air between them crackled with a raw, ancient hatred, while Sean retreated into the corner of his chair, pressing his palms over his ears to block out the jagged edges of Fiona's cries and Margaret's poisonous retorts. Margaret suddenly straightened her spine and, with a burst of unexpected power, shoved her palms into Fiona's chest. Fiona reeled, her heels catching on the rug as she slammed hard against the refrigerator door. Margaret loomed over her, her gray eyes narrowing into two frozen slivers of ice. She spat the words through her teeth, telling Fiona she was too weak, too pathetic to raise Sean into a real man. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron with a slow, deliberate motion, declaring that only she possessed the steel required to forge the boy's character. Fiona gasped for air, a dull ache blooming between her shoulder blades, while Margaret stood tall, radiating a total, crushing contempt for everything Fiona tried to build. Fiona reached a shaking hand toward Sean, trying to pull him toward the hallway and the safety of his bedroom. Margaret moved like a predator, her massive frame blocking the doorway, elbows flared to seal the exit. Sean looked between them, his chest heaving with a shallow, panicked rhythm. Margaret's shadow stretched long and dark across the kitchen floor, swallowing the boy's feet. Every time Fiona tried to sidestep, Margaret mirrored the movement, her face a mask of immovable granite. The boy was trapped in the crossfire of their breathing, a small, pale ghost caught between two warring suns. Margaret's hand dove slowly into the deep pocket of her knitted cardigan. With a sharp, metallic clatter, she pulled out a ring of keys, the brass teeth of a new duplicate glinting under the fluorescent light. She began to twirl the ring around her index finger, a rhythmic, irritating sound of metal on skin. The steel caught the dull kitchen light, throwing cold sparks into Fiona's dilated pupils. Margaret stepped closer, invading Fiona's personal air, the keys whistling inches from Fiona's nose. Each rotation of the ring felt like a flag being planted on conquered soil, a silent, mocking declaration that no lock in this house would ever again keep Margaret from the things she wanted to control. Margaret drew herself up to her full height, her voice sharpening into the jagged edge of broken glass. She began to hammer out words, ticking off items on her fingers as she recounted every hairline fracture in Fiona's failed marriage. She spat out accusations like venom, linking the departure of her son to the sterile, stinging scent of antiseptic that Fiona brought home from her night shifts. Margaret savored the details of Fiona's isolation, calling her a statue of ice, a woman incapable of keeping a hearth warm. Fiona stood there, hearing herself accused of betraying her family for the sake of strangers in ICU beds. Every word Margaret threw was a scalpel, peeling back old scars and forcing Fiona to clench her fists until her knuckles turned the color of bone. Sean's face suddenly drained of its last remaining color, turning waxy and translucent under the overhead light. He sucked in a sharp, whistling breath, his small hands knotting into the fabric of his t-shirt over his stomach. He doubled over, his forehead thumping against the edge of the table as a violent shudder racked his thin frame. In the sudden, heavy silence of the kitchen, the boy's labored, hitching breath sounded like a bellows. He let out a low, primal groan, his knees buckling until they knocked hollowly against the chair leg. Fiona watched the cold sweat bead on his brow, his fingers scratching frantically at the tablecloth for a grip against the rising tide of agony clawing through his gut. Fiona leaped for her son, arms outstretched to catch his sagging weight, but Margaret's sharp elbow caught her in the ribs. Margaret shoved her aside with a grunt of exertion, physically walling her off from the boy. She let out a derisive snort, looking down at the crumpled child and claiming it was nothing but a cheap act for his mother's attention. Margaret gripped Sean's shoulder, trying to haul him upright, shaking him like a discarded rag doll. Fiona saw the boy's head loll helplessly from side to side as Margaret ranted about spoiled children and theatrical whims. A white-hot rage began to boil in Fiona's gut, crashing against Margaret's impenetrable wall of self-righteousness and her absolute chilling indifference to the boy's pain. Sean's body bucked with a massive spasm, and the remnants of the greasy dinner erupted onto the light carpet in a thick, foul-smelling heap. At that exact moment, a dry, electrical pop echoed from within the walls, the old wiring finally surrendering to the strain. The bright kitchen lights died instantly, replaced by an absolute, crushing darkness. The air grew heavy with the stench of sickness and the acrid tang of scorched insulation. Fiona heard Sean choking on a cough in the blackness, followed by Margaret's sharp, panicked yelp. The apartment filled with a chaotic symphony of sliding fabric, heavy breathing, and the dull thud of Margaret's body colliding with furniture. Fiona stood paralyzed for a heartbeat, her vision gone, feeling only the creeping, sticky cold spreading across the floor from where Sean had fallen. Fiona thrust her hands out, clawing through the damp, humid air as she tried to map the hallway in her mind. Her palms struck the cold corners of the walls and the rough texture of the wallpaper as she felt her way toward the small wooden console. Her fingers scrambled over the top shelf, knocking aside old mail and dusty ceramic figurines. But they found no cold comfort of metal. She caught her elbow on the coat rack, and the heavy winter parkas slid to the floor with a muffled thud, blocking her path. Her brain pulsed with a single, frantic thought. The car keys. She needed them to rip Sean out of this nightmare. The darkness felt physical, a weight pressing down on her shoulders as she feverishly explored every inch of the empty drawer. Margaret's voice drifted out of the dark, a rattling, unnatural laugh that sent a shiver down Fiona's spine. With a mocking lilt, she announced that during her morning inspection, she had moved the keys to a place Fiona would never think to look. Margaret declared that she wouldn't allow the boy out in such a downpour, and that Fiona was too unstable to be trusted behind a wheel anyway. The voice came from somewhere near the kitchen, sounding triumphant and unhinged in the void. Fiona felt her fury swallow her fear as Margaret continued to lecture about the boy's safety, all while holding him hostage in a pitch-black room during a medical crisis. Fiona began to tear the room apart. Her hands swept vases from tables, and they shattered against the floor with the sound of gunfire. She yanked drawers from the dresser, dumping their contents into the dark while the glass of photo frames crunched under her boots. Margaret began to wail, her voice climbing to a high, piercing frequency as she heard the destruction of her order. Fiona ignored the noise, her fingers digging into the upholstery of the armchairs, probing the deep crevices between cushions and raking through every shelf. The din of breaking china drowned out the rain lashing against the windows, and Margaret scrambled nearby, her hands clawing at Fiona's clothes to stop the frantic, destructive search that had become Fiona's only hope for her son's survival. Sean's moans grew quieter, fading into a shallow, rattling wheeze that made Fiona's heart seize with terror. She fumbled her phone from her pocket, but the screen only blinded her with a flat white glare, showing a dead signal bar. The storm and the thick brick walls had killed the reception, leaving them in a vacuum. In the weak glow of the screen, Fiona saw Sean's head tilt back at a sickening angle, his eyelids fluttering. Margaret muttered to herself, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the moment, while Fiona shook the phone in a desperate, useless arc, praying for a single bar of service. The silence of the apartment was now broken only by the heavy, rhythmic gasping of a child losing consciousness in his mother's arms. Margaret went suddenly quiet, followed by the dull thud of her knees hitting the parquet floor in the center of the kitchen. A rapid, monotonous muttering filled the dark as she began to chant prayers, her body swaying back and forth. She called upon the saints, listing Fiona's sins and begging for Sean's healing, creating a dense, suffocating wall of noise. The fanatical whispering clogged Fiona's ears, making it impossible to hear the sound of falling objects that might lead her to the keys. Fiona nearly tripped over the woman, who had latched onto the hem of Fiona's trousers with a death grip. Margaret was lost in a religious trance, her eyes shut tight against the reality of the dying boy, her fingers digging into Fiona's leg like claws. The light from the phone screen flicked across the kitchen shelf, catching the chipped edge of an old ceramic sugar bowl. Fiona lunged for it, thrusting her hand deep into the gritty sweetness of the sugar, until her fingers closed around the cold, jagged teeth of the keys. She gripped the metal so hard the ring bit into her palm. When Margaret tried to block her path, wailing another prayer, Fiona delivered a sharp, powerful shove with her shoulder. Margaret spun away, clattering into the kitchen chairs and hitting the floor with a heavy grunt. Fiona didn't look back. Her movements were a blur of focused intent as she scooped Sean's limp body from the floor and ran for the door. Fiona kicked the heavy intake doors of the emergency room open with her shoulder, letting in a swirl of freezing rain and the scent of wet asphalt. Sean hung in her arms, a dead weight, his head lolling with every frantic step she took. Her sneakers left muddy, squelching prints on the sterile white linoleum. She screamed for help, her voice cracking over the hum of the automatic doors and the roar of the storm outside. The triage nurse looked up, seeing Fiona clutching the pale boy to her chest, his lips a haunting shade of blue under the harsh, buzzing hospital lights. Margaret burst into the lobby moments later, water spraying from her sodden coat as she swung her heavy handbag like a weapon. As the orderlies pushed a gurney forward, Margaret wedged herself between them, her hands gripping the metal rails to keep Sean in place. She shoved a young male nurse with her elbow, shouting that she was the only one who knew the boy's history. Her bag thudded against the side of the gurney as it began to roll. Fiona watched Margaret claw at the sheets, trying to slow the doctors down, until they firmly forced her back behind the red line that marked the boundary of the trauma ward. Fiona collapsed onto the hard plastic of a waiting room chair, feeling her damp shirt stick to the cold surface. She looked down at her hands. Road grime was packed under her nails, and her forearms were streaked with the dried, sticky remains of the dinner Sean's stomach couldn't hold. The scent of sickness mingled with the sharp, biting aroma of floor wax, making her stomach churn. Her fingers continued to twitch, closing and opening as if they still carried the boy's weight. She stared at her knees, where dark, jagged water stains from the rain were blooming across her trousers, and felt a fine, uncontrollable tremor work its way from her neck to her fingertips. Margaret sat on the chair directly across from Fiona, her back as straight as a spear, her lips pinched tight. She pulled a smartphone from her pocket and, holding it inches from her mouth, began to dictate a message, her voice loud and enunciated. She called out her lawyer's name, detailing what she called criminal negligence and the filthy conditions Fiona kept the boy in. The voice echoed through the quiet corridor, forcing the few other waiting families to look away in embarrassment. Margaret threw icy glares at Fiona, recording every detail of her daughter-in-law's disheveled appearance into the voice memo, methodically turning a medical emergency into a legal dossier. The door to the exam room swung open, and the attending physician stepped out, rubbing the bridge of his nose beneath his goggles. Fiona stood up instantly, her eyes locked on his mouth. He told her they had started an IV to replace the fluids Sean had lost. Fiona heard words like critical dehydration and severe intoxication from the salt and fat his system couldn't process. The doctor frowned as he looked over Sean's chart, confirming that the boy was in the middle of a violent pancreatic flare-up. Fiona felt the floor tilt beneath her as he mentioned the need for long-term monitoring of the boy's internal organs. Margaret was on her feet before the doctor could even finish, her fingers stabbing toward Fiona like a pike. She yelled at the top of her lungs, accusing Fiona of intentionally making the boy sick to spite her. She told the doctor that Fiona had starved the child all day just to trigger a crisis and tarnish Margaret's name. Margaret's face broke out in angry red splotches, her voice rising to a screech as she claimed Fiona was using the boy's illness as a weapon in a family feud. Fiona recoiled, stunned by the sheer absurdity of the lie, while Margaret continued her frantic, venomous performance for the bewildered medical staff. Margaret fished a business card from her bag and shook it in Fiona's face, announcing that a social worker was already on the way. She promised to document every bruise and every hour Fiona spent away from her chronically ill son. Margaret hammered home phrases like unfit environment and professional detachment, claiming Fiona's work in the ICU had stripped her of her humanity. Fiona watched Margaret adjust her collar with a smug, satisfied air, clearly relishing the moment. In Margaret's eyes, this hospital visit wasn't a tragedy. It was the perfect opportunity to finally strip Fiona of her rights. Fiona pushed through the narrow gap of the partially open door, heading for Sean's bedside. A nurse stepped in her way, citing the one-visitor rule. But Margaret lunged from behind, trying to duck under the woman's arm. Margaret used her elbows with practiced precision, ignoring the nurse's protests and Fiona's demands for her to stop. In the cramped space of the room, they became a tangle of limbs and coats. Margaret's breath was hot against the back of Fiona's neck, smelling of peppermint and wet wool. Fiona tried to block the path with her body, but Margaret shoved her aside with surprising force, invading the sterile silence where Sean lay beneath a thin white sheet. Margaret dropped to her knees at the foot of the bed and began to wail, her hands fling up in a theatrical display of grief. She spoke to the sleeping boy, calling Fiona a homewrecker and the source of all his misery. Her voice shook with a forced, vibrating sorrow as she cursed Fiona's career, claiming the hospital had burned the soul out of her. Margaret grabbed the edge of the boy's blanket, shaking the entire bed with the force of her sobbing. Fiona watched Margaret escalate the performance, turning the small room into a stage where Fiona was the villain and Margaret the only savior, despite the vomit still drying on her own shoes. Fiona glanced at the monitor above Sean's head and saw the green pulse line begin to spike into jagged, irregular peaks. The numbers flashed red, signaling a heart rate climbing in response to the chaos in the room. Sean began to toss under the sheet, his brow furrowing in pain, a low, ragged moan escaping his throat. Fiona saw the boy's fingers knot into the fabric of the bed in response to Margaret's shrieks. Every new cry from the woman made the sensors beep with increasing urgency. Fiona realized Margaret's hysteria was physically hurting the boy, dragging him out of a much-needed sleep and back into a waking nightmare. The lead physician strode into the room, his face darkened by an immediate, sharp anger. He snapped a reprimand at Fiona, pointing to the monitors that were now howling in alarm. He told her that this kind of behavior was unacceptable in an intensive care setting and that as a nurse, she should have known better. Margaret tried to talk over him with fresh complaints. But the doctor reached for the wall-mounted phone, promising to have security clear the room immediately. Fiona saw his hand hover over the receiver and knew if they didn't stop now, they'd both be hauled out, leaving Sean alone at his most vulnerable hour. Fiona took a sudden, sharp step forward, planting herself between her son's bed and the screaming woman. She squared her shoulders, her gaze turning as cold and hard as a surgical blade. She stopped shaking. She felt a crystalline, icy resolve harden in her chest. She stared directly into Margaret's blown-out pupils, realizing the time for diplomacy and fear had ended. In Fiona's mind, a single thought pulsed. Either she ended Margaret's reign now, or she'd lose her son forever. She drew a slow, deep breath, preparing to speak the words that would cut the ties. Fiona closed the distance until her shadow fell across Margaret's face. Her voice came out without a single tremor, a dry, metallic sound like a blade on a whetstone. She pointed a steady finger toward the automatic doors and the empty, sterile stretch of the night hallway. Margaret opened her mouth to snap back, but Fiona took one more short, commanding step, physically crowding the older woman out of the room. The beeping of the monitors behind Fiona began to slow as Margaret's noisy, damp presence was forced across the threshold. Fiona pulled the door shut with a solid click, sealing the room and the boy away from the noise of the world. Margaret tried to surge back toward the bed, but Fiona's hand went up, her palm flat and unyielding at the level of Margaret's chest. The hand didn't shake. It was an immovable barrier. Fiona didn't look Margaret in the eye, but slightly above them, maintaining the chilling mask of professional distance she used in the trauma ward. Margaret slammed into that invisible wall and stopped. Every movement Fiona made was calculated and efficient. She didn't allow Margaret so much as a finger's reach toward Sean's sheets. Fiona stood there as a living shield, a wall of hospital discipline that Margaret's chaotic rage couldn't penetrate. In the dim, yellow light of the hallway, Fiona leaned in close to Margaret's ear. Her breath barely brushed the woman's skin, but the words fell like stones. Fiona whispered about the hidden cameras she'd installed in the living room, cameras that had caught every shove and every cruel word from the night before. She described how clearly Margaret's face looked in those frames when she was losing her mind. Margaret froze, her lower lip beginning to twitch. Fiona promised that those recordings would be on a police sergeant's desk within the hour if Margaret didn't take her hand off the door handle. Fiona's stare pinned the woman to the wall, stripping her of the ability to speak. Fiona reached out and snatched the leather strap of Margaret's handbag. Margaret let out a small, strangled yelp as Fiona yanked the zipper open and upended the bag over a low vinyl bench. A compact, a mess of crumpled receipts, pill bottles, and a heavy wallet tumbled out. Fiona methodically raked through the pile with her fingertips, ignoring Margaret's protesting gasps. She tossed aside an eyeglass case and a bottle of perfume that rolled across the floor with a hollow clatter. Every item belonging to Margaret was swept aside until Fiona found the one thing that gave the woman power over a home that wasn't hers. Among the scattered debris, Fiona caught the dull glint of brass. She dove into the pile and pulled out the key ring with its heavy, familiar fob. The metal was still warm from Margaret's body, but Fiona squeezed it so hard the teeth bit into her skin, leaving deep red welts. She felt the pulse thudding in her palm, but she didn't let go. Margaret reached for them, but Fiona tucked her hand behind her back, a spark of pure triumph lighting her eyes. That symbol of intrusion now belonged to her, and she felt the weight of her own life returning to her grasp. Margaret drew a breath to launch a fresh volley of insults. But Fiona cut her off before she could start. Fiona laid out the terms: 30 days of absolute silence, and Margaret was to stay a mile away from the house. She mentioned a restraining order she was prepared to sign that very night if Margaret even looked toward the boy's room again. Her voice was a final judgment, leaving no room for negotiation. Margaret looked at Fiona's face and saw a mother who would burn the world down to protect her nest. The ultimatum hung in the air like a lead weight. Margaret suddenly sagged, the invisible spine that held her upright finally snapping. Her mask of arrogance crumbled, revealing a web of deep wrinkles and a hollow, extinguished gaze. Her shoulders slumped, and the fingers that had been balled into fists now plucked aimlessly at the hem of her wet coat. Fiona watched as the woman looked away, unable to meet the burning intensity of the stare. Margaret looked like nothing more than a small, tired old woman in the vast, echoing hallway of the hospital. For the first time in years, a silence fell between them that wasn't a weapon, but a total surrender. Fiona watched the defeat, feeling no pity. Fiona picked up the empty handbag and handed it back with a look of pure indifference. Margaret reached for Fiona's sleeve, her lips moving without sound, forming the shapes of excuses, or perhaps a plea for mercy. Fiona jerked her arm away, as if she'd been touched by something diseased. She pointed a long, straight arm toward the elevators, marking the only path Margaret had left. Margaret stood still for a second, looking at Fiona's stony face, then turned and began the long walk down the corridor. Fiona watched the bent back of the woman until she disappeared around the corner, and only then did she allow herself a single, deep breath of air. Fiona stepped back into the room, where the air smelled of medicine and quiet. She sat on the edge of the bed and covered Sean's small, warm hand with her own. The boy sighed in his sleep, his eyelashes finally still, his face smooth and peaceful. Fiona watched the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest and the steady green line on the monitor. The room was empty of screams and old ghosts, filled only with the hum of the machines keeping him safe. She sat there, feeling the warmth of him seep into her skin, and made a silent vow that no shadow would ever fall across this bed again as long as she stood watch. The first rays of a gray, New England sun were cutting through the blinds when Fiona walked out of the hospital. She gave a short nod to a colleague at the desk and caught a yellow cab. The car sped through empty streets, tires hissing through the puddles. Fiona didn't go home to sleep. She got out at an old locksmith shop on the corner that smelled of oil and burnt steel. She laid the keys she'd taken from Margaret on the counter. The master took a blank, and Fiona watched the fountain of sparks fly from the grinding wheel. She took the new, heavy set, feeling the cold weight of them in her jacket pocket like a promise. Fiona stood before her own front door, looking at the scratches in the wood around the lock, the scars of Margaret's many uninvited entries. She nodded to the locksmith, who was already backing out the old screws. She watched the worn-out mechanism fall to the floor, the gateway Margaret had used to haunt them. The new lock gleamed with cold chrome. The man drove the heavy bolts into the frame, reinforcing the defense. Fiona ran her fingers over the fresh metal, feeling its strength. Every strike of the hammer echoed in her chest as a victory. When the job was done, she stood before a barrier that no duplicate in Margaret's pocket would ever turn again. Fiona slid the new key into the narrow slot and turned it twice. The heavy, muffled thud of the deadbolt sliding home was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door, listening to the silence of an apartment that was finally, truly her own. Behind this door, there was no smell of Margaret's food, no sound of her prayers. Fiona stood there in the quiet, the key still gripped tight in her hand.